Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another Torah video here in the Pilgrim Youth channel. My name is Elizabeth Dionisio, and I am very happy and excited to announce that we are going to study our last chapter of Leviticus, along with a general conclusion in today's class. Next week we will begin with the book called Sefer, which means book, Bamidbar, which means numbers, the book of Numbers. And we will continue in that book to learn more about life lessons regarding the story of Israel as a nation before Mashiach was manifested to this world, and to learn their application in those application of lessons in our life as believers in Yeshua Mashiach. Let's recap a little bit of what we learned last week. Last week in chapter 26 of Leviticus, we learned about the warnings that the Eternal gives and also the blessings the Eternal gave to Israel if they chose to obey or disobey his instruction. The Heavenly Father, from the beginning of creation, has given humanity a choice to willingly submit to him and to his instruction, and view it and understand that these instructions is a vital piece of our life in order for us to walk in consecration, or to walk away from it because people love the riches and fame and all of the earthly things of this world more than the instruction of the Eternal. The Eternal explains to Israel in last week's chapters, if you walk in my statutes, keep my mitzvot, that's the Hebrew word for commandment, and carry them out, meaning practice them, then I will give you rains in their season. The land will yield its crops, and the trees of the field will yield their fruit. So we saw last week the prosperity of Israel depended heavily on their decision to be faithful solely to Adonai and consciously fulfilling the commandments given to them with the correct spirit and the correct meaning. It wasn't just to do it just because of doing it, but they actually had to understand why the Eternal was asking them to do it in the first place. In that time of Israel in which the context of the text was written, being prosperous was to have fertile lands, lands that would give good fruits in order for them to sell them, in order for them to sustain themselves, and to have many animals, a lot of cattle, a lot of sheep, because with those were a big resource for them to have, make money, and as well as for themselves, making sheepskins and etc. That's why in chapter 26, we see a long list of blessings that the Eternal gave relating to agriculture and fertility of the land. But once again, all this was contingent on Israel's obedience to what was commanded by the Eternal in their lives. On the other hand, Elohim also declared clearly in this chapter what would happen to any soul that would decide to disobey willingly, knowingly, and continue to live, and then he continues to give a long list as well. And in verse 21 from chapter 26, it said the following: if you keep walking contrary to me and will not listen to me, then I will multiply the plagues on you 7 times like your sin. Unfortunately, we know in the story of Israel that they did rebel against the Eternal, and all of these calamities that Elohim declares in this chapter came true for them. However, there were some who, by experiencing these consequences, their hearts were humbled, and they made teshuvah, which means they repented, they understood, they recognized their sin, and now they're coming back to the Eternal because they understand that what they did was totally incorrect, and now they want to make amends with the Eternal by showing a life of obedience. The Eternal also promised to turn back to them, because as we know, when Israel rebelled, the Eternal turned his face away, which means that he no longer wanted to be associated with them, in the sense that he no longer protected them, because it was all under a condition of obedience. And when an Israelite did teshuvah, was coming back to him, the Eternal promised to turn back his face towards them and show them favor again. So we see that the same warnings and consequences are still very relevant in our time. The Eternal wishes that we choose to obey and be loyal to Him by departing from the idolatrous and abominable practices of this world and living according to His instruction to avoid the judgments that He sends to those who are in direct rebellion to Him. So for us, today we are to listen to Elohim sent, His Son, whom we find His instruction without blemish, as we see it and confirmed in Luke 9, verse 35. The voice of the Eternal confirmed Yeshua as the source to whom we need to listen to. It says in verse 35, "Then a voice came out of the cloud saying, 'This is my Son, and the only one I have chosen. Listen to him.'" So in our time, perhaps our obedience doesn't look the same because we don't have a temple, because we don't have ministers, we don't have all of these specifications that we will see today and all of the specifications that we have seen throughout this book. But today, our grand minister, as we have already learned, our unblemished lamb, the sacrifice that brings us close to the Eternal, is Yeshua. And that's why it's very important as youth for us to understand the role of Yeshua in our life, and that we continue to walk towards Him in the sense of, so for us to learn His testimony, for us to understand the words that He came to interpret, the Torah, in order for us to walk correctly in the right direction towards the Father, now that we're making as well teshuvah, leaving the practice of this world in order for us to be in the family of the Eternal, because we know that anyone who rebels against the Eternal is also His enemy. But when we are reconciliated back to Him through Yeshua, then we become His family. We become part of Him. And the way that we do that is that we become part of Him in sanctification, in holiness. And then that's why we should know that if we reject or we do not adhere to the example or the words that Mashiach came to give, then we risk falling into the same rebellion of Israel that Israel fell for not listening to the instruction that was given to them through Moshe. So with this, let us continue with chapter 26. And it's very interesting because in this chapter, in this last chapter, the Creator continues to instruct the nation of Israel through His commandments that He established, specifically in order related to vows, VOWS, or promises that an Israelite would pledge. These instructions were for those who voluntarily wanted to submit, wanted to devote something or dedicate something to the Creator, whether it be dedicate people, their children, themselves, etc., animals as well, we will see in this chapter, and properties and fields, etc. We also will know that these votes did not only consist of just pledging just simple words. We know the common term that the words, the wind takes them, right? Because they can be so inconsistent. But this kind of vows or promises that was going to be given to the Eternal had to be backed up with a certain level of consecration ministered by the earthly Kohanim, or the ministers that were working in the sanctuary, who made good use of all of the stuff that a person would bring to the temple in order to be consecrated and given to the Eternal. And we will also see that the Eternal, all of these things that were given to the Kohanim was going to be in good use according to the Eternal's will, and not for the Kohanim to search their own interest or their own benefit or to enrich themselves. Another thing we should know before we start this portion is that by not presenting a vote or a promise without actually having to promise the Eternal, meaning that if I never promised it to the Eternal, it's not considered a sin, especially if the item or the thing that we want to consecrate is not something to the standard of perfection that in that time had to be brought. Because if we remember throughout this entire book, that nothing that had blemish or tainted could be acceptable in the service of the Eternal in the sanctuary. Everything, including animals, the people that work there, the utensils, everything had to be to perfection. So The problem here was when a person promised or devoted something, but was not fulfilling it. Meaning, like, let's say, oh, I promised to the Eternal that I'm going to give him 2 sheep, and that we just say it with our mouth, but we don't actually do it. That is when the sin fell upon or falls upon us as well. So we see in Deuteronomy 23, from verse 22 to 24, that tells us the following: when you make a vow, a vowel to Adonai, your Elohim, you are not to delay to make good on it. For Adonai, your Elohim, will certainly require it of you, and you would have sin on you. But if you refrain from making a vow, you would not have sin on you. Whatever comes out of your lips, you are to take care to do it, since you have vowed to Adonai, your Elohim, a free will offering that you have promised with your mouth. So this is important to understand, because we as believers are to reflect the Eternal's character in all aspects of our lives. And we know that the Eternal always fulfills his promises, as it is confirmed in Numbers 23 verse 19. It says, Elohim is not a man who lies, or a son of man who changes his mind. Doesn't he speak and then not do it, or promise and not fulfill it? So here we see that the Eternal is truly faithful to everything that he will give us. And in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 from verse 3 to 4, King Solomon himself also advises the following: when you swear a vow to Elohim, do not delay to fulfill it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better for you not to vow than to vow and not pay. So in other words, we have to understand that everything that we say, especially when making promises to our Heavenly Father, we need to understand that he does take those words seriously and then is expecting us to fulfill them. Yeshua himself taught the same principle in Matthew 5 verse 37 that says, but let your word yes be yes and your no be no. Anything more than this is from the evil one. So we see how important it is for us youth people to remember that we can't just say whatever we want. And even in our prayers as well, when we are praying to the Eternal, we're communicating with him in union. We have to be careful of the things that we are actually saying and be conscious. If we're saying, Father, consecrate my life, then it's something that we're consciously understanding that what is that going to take. What is it going to take the Eternal for us to actually be consecrated? And that's something that we have to be very careful and mindful of. Currently, although there are no ministers in our time, no earthly place like a sanctuary, we can also make a vow to the Creator through Mashiach, who is now our grand minister. That means that he makes us the one. That Yeshua is the one who brings us close to the Supreme One, not through pastors, prophets, or in any religious system. The promises we make must also be true, a genuine vote, presented in due time and form. Otherwise, we make a mockery of the Eternal's favor and mercy. And it's something that I've reflected in this week about this specific portion is, I remember when I used to go, when I was in the part of the religious system, and I would remember very vividly how people in the religious system would say, I'm yours, God, guide me, work on me, I give you all of me, my life, my goods, my family, my health, time, etc. All of this is in your hand, and I'll let your will be done in my life. These are common phrases that we hear very often in the religious systems, but in reality are just vain words that when we are saying, Eternal, here is my life, here is everything of me, we're literally saying, Father, mold me into what you want me to be, which means that it can be through tests, it can be through difficulty, it will be through refining fire. And sometimes as believers, we're not prepared for all of that. And that is something that we need to learn as well, that when we're saying all of these things, we have to truly understand what we're asking the Eternal to do. is to make us feel uncomfortable in where we are, because we don't feel like we're actually being worked on. So it's something that we really have to be careful, that it's not just words that we repeat as a mantra, as phrases of motivation, or something that will calm our conscience down because maybe we've done something, and by just saying like, work on me, Father, I'm all yours, it makes us feel better. But we really mainly have to remember that by us asking the Eternal to do his will in our life, but then not permitting him to actually do his will, it's just becoming words that the wind will take. And all of the words that we have to say, when we don't put them into practice, then they're just words, and they end up with, these are words with no foundation. And we have to remember that whatever we say, for example, I give you all of me, all of my time, here's my children, or etc., we must understand that there's supposed to be action behind those words in order for them to become true, in order for them to become that shows that we are truly wanting the Eternal to work in our lives. So this is something that we will see throughout this entire chapter, and that we have to be careful not to be repeating vain phrases that are empty in search of some personal interest, guided not by a good will, but by the nature of the flesh or emotions. So with this, I'm not going to be reading the chapter, the actual text of the scriptures today, just because of we don't have that much time in our video. I will be giving what the meanings, or what I have reflected on from verses to verses. So from verse 1 to 8 explains how the Eternal assigned a value in shekels or of silver to the people of Israel according to their age, their sex, etc. All of this determined the production or the utility of the people who wanted to consecrate them. This by no means was to say that they were going to, like, a person that was being consecrated was going to replace the work of the Levites in the tent of meeting. Instead, the ransom price was paid according to the value of the person. Even if someone did not have enough money or did not have enough resources to pay his price, the important thing was their goodwill, to make his or her vow to the Creator according to their possibilities and according to the price set by the minister. The process of placing a price or valuing people could sometimes seem, especially in this chapter, like a negative thing to those who read it in this portion. That's why it's important to read the text of the Torah in its correct time frame and context. With this, the Creator was not being a receptor or showing favoritism of a certain group of people, sex, or age. For we know that the Eternal has no favoritism. There were instructions given by the Eternal. They were instructions given to Moshe in order for him to give to Israel about being partial. If we remember in Leviticus 19:15, it says, "You are not to do no injustice in judgment. You are not to be partial towards the poor, nor show favoritism towards the great, but you are to judge your neighbor with fairness." So we see that this is a commandment that the Eternal himself gave to the people of Israel, and he himself is also an example of us, who shows us that he is not partial to anyone. We see that in Yeshua's disciples also came to the same conclusion in Acts chapter 10 verse 34 to 35 that says the following: "Then Peter opened his mouth and said, I truly understand that Elohim is not one that shows favoritism, but in every nation the one who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." So before the Almighty, we are all created and we are all equal. Here in these texts was according to what each person can contribute according to their age and sex, that in the case of a woman, for example, was less, not because she was worth less, but because their work within the tent of meeting was limited. Men were the ones who were ministers, who ministered in that area, since women fulfilled other functions within their homes, with their families and their children. From verse 9 to 13, we will see that the Eternal establishes how the animals were also to be valued, and also lets us know that they could be consecrated to the Eternal or separated for the Eternal. In the case that were clean, meaning if they were deemed as kosher animals or and without blemish, as stated in Leviticus 11, then that was, the price was maybe was more higher or was given more importance for the purpose. And the reason why was because these animals were going to be used for sacrifices and hence the livelihood of the Levites. Once these were consecrated, there were no exchanges for a better one or worse one, and in the event that there was, both were to be consecrated. However, in the case that a person brought an unclean animal, because that's the only thing that they could have, and they really wanted to give a vote to the Eternal, we know that an animal that was less than perfect was definitely not fit to be consumed as an offering in sacrifice, or even less given to the Levites, because remember the Levites were also consecrated to the Eternal. They could also be used for from other tasks. For example, maybe be animals of cargo that they would transport things back and forth. They could also be used to be sold as merchandise that was used in the tent of meetings, if they desired. If the person wanted to recover the animal once it had been consecrated, they had to pay its price plus a fifth, which is a 20%. And we will see kind of the same principles throughout all of the verses as well. From verse 14 to 15, we see an explanation of the process, explains the process if a house also wanted to be consecrated or given as a vote or a promise to the Eternal. It was possible to consecrate a house to the Creator and continue, and the person also can continue residing in them. They were presented to the ministers, who gave his valuation, determining it either good or bad according to the valuation, and the one who wanted to consecrate it paid. And also, if he wanted to rescue it after being consecrated, meaning that once he gave it into consecration and he said, no, I probably need it for another use, in, like, for example, a house that I consecrate, and then I say, I see that I was really supposed to have it as a bakery shop, then that person that would want to bring it back again to them and not have it consecrated in the sense that they were going to, I don't know, like, for example, like separate it to do something else or have a different purpose, then they had to pay the Kohanim again the valuation plus an added fifth, in order for them to kind of recover the house back and use it for another purpose. Because if we remember that consecration has to do with a specific purpose of a specific time. So just like the Kohanim, or the ministers that were in the Holy Temple, they were consecrated for a specific time for them to be in service in the temple. So we see that all of the things that are consecrated to the Eternal, they can't be used for anything else. So that's why when a person decided to redeem it back to them, it's because they had another purpose for it. Doesn't mean that they were going to do sin or anything like that, but it was simply not going to be it wasn't going to be like in how they intended for that house to be consecrated. And that's why we see like all of these, that people consecrating, giving stuff to the Eternal, consecrating people and such and such and so then they were able to buy, like, specifically the animals and the houses back with a 20% more, of course. And it's interesting, why were these votes or these promises by the Creator valued? That's something that I kind of asked myself. And if we see the text, it shows in both of the cases of the animals, people, and houses, etc., that all of this was part of a vow, really, that was given as a voluntarily way. And the reason why the Eternal wanted these promises or these vows or these things that were going to be presented to be the best and the first was because it represented not only did it not, how can I say it? Not only did it not, if somebody gave something that wasn't that was less than perfect, then it wouldn't actually be used for the temple, in the service of the temple inside, because again, everything had to be to the level of sanctification that the Eternal established. And if they were not, they were used for something else. So with this, we remember that to the Eternal, when we give something to him, we are to give him the first things. We're not to give him to just the last, or like, oh, whatever I have left, or I'm gonna give him like the most ugliest sheep for the Eternal and still think that we are going to be in his favor. It's the same thing in our life. And even something that happened in an example of Yeshua himself, that we see in Mark 12 from verse 41 to 44 with the poor widow, that it says that she put, that when everybody, even the ministers, were giving their tzedakah, or they were giving their contribution in the box, Yeshua said that the widow was actually the one who put in the most than all of the other Pharisees, than all of the other religious men and women that were putting in there, because she gave her all. She gave everything that she had, all of the things that she possessed. She put everything, her whole life, everything, that to the Eternal, which teaches us that whenever we want to give to the Eternal something, it must be the first and the best of what we have, with no reservations, especially when it comes to our spirituality. This can also be a representation of the house where our soul dwells, our bodies, right? That as believers, we should consecrate everything that goes in them and what we do with our bodies, what we eat, what we wear, etc. For they are our sanctuaries, where the presence of the Eternal wants to dwell, wants to live in order for him to give his Ruach HaKodesh in order to guide our steps, our life. So we see all of these representations in these verses. From verse 16 to 25, just as people, houses, and animals had a valuation, and they were all different. They were different, and different aspects were taken into account. In the case of the land that was now given the value as well, it was not different. They were valued according to the production of the land. It was established by the Eternal that 50 shekels of silver, or an omer, which was in that time was a form of measure, was supposed to be given. And it is important that the valuation of the land had to do with a specific time in which it was given. And also the reason why was because the Jubilee was the Jubilee year was taken into consideration. So if we remember that a Jubilee, which is like a rest that the Eternal, or something that happened every 50 years, where the lands were returned to the original owners and the slaves were freed. So the further away the time of the Jubilee was, where if like an Israelite would bring it, and let's say the Jubilee was still like, and they were in the year, let's say like 5 before the Jubilee started again, then the price would be higher. And vice versa, if the time of the Jubilee was close, so let's say like the year 48, then the price of the land that they were consecrating to the Eternal was lower, because the person who was buying it would not have a lot of time to benefit from it, you can say, and then benefit from it before giving it back to its owner. So in order to redeem these lands, the person had to pay its valuation plus the subtraction before the land was sold. And in the year of the Jubilee, it was totally consecrated to the Creator as a possession of the Levites. So instead of giving that land back to the owner, it was now in possession of the Levites, who, as we remember, they did not own any property. Why? Because all of the Eternal's portion that was supposed to be given to the Eternal said that he was going to share it with the Levites. Even if someone was not the rightful owner, they could still consecrate the land for as long as it took for the Jubilee year before he returned it. So, from verse 26 and 27 talks about the exceptions of offerings and the ransom of the vows. So the things mentioned above are those that could be consecrated voluntarily in the case of the firstborn animals. It did not depend on the will. It was something that belonged to the Creator no matter what. And they were to be presented in sacrifice. But in the case that the firstborn of the animal had any defect, they could not bring it to sacrifice. So if I had a sheep who had firstborn, and let's say that it had like some kind of defect of skin or anything, I couldn't present that as a sacrifice to the Eternal, because it had blemish on it. It was tainted. So therefore I had to redeem it. It's an example. So the solution was to ransom it, or that a ransom should be given by paying it and plus an added fee of a fifth value. Otherwise, they were sold by their value, and the money was used in the tent of meetings. Another thing that we see from verse 28 to 33, I'm going to read the verses, that says the following. Nevertheless, no devoted thing which a man sets apart from all that he has for Adonai, whether man or animal, or from the field of his possession, may be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to Adonai. 29. No one who may be set apart from men for destruction is to be ransomed. He is surely to be put to death. All the tithes of the land, whether from the seed of the land or the fruit of the trees, belong to Adonai. It is holy to Adonai. If a man redeems anything of his tithes, he must add a fifth part to it. From all the tithes of the herds or the flocks, whatever passes under the rod, a tenth will be holy to Adonai. One is not to inquire if it is good or bad, nor exchange it, or if he does exchange it, then both it and that for it which was exchanged will become holy and may not be redeemed. So we see here that finally the Eternal added that the things that were dedicated voluntarily, such as houses, animals, people, and the lands, became very holy, separate things. They were no longer just any ransom item. Now they were set aside for the Creator's will. If a person wanted to rescue them, they had to pay their valuation, adding a fifth part. And it's interesting here in verse 29 that kind of caught my attention, because I saw that it was interpreted in two ways. So in verse 29 says the following, just so we can remember. No one who may be set apart from men for destruction is to be ransomed. He is surely to be put to death. So at first sight, the verse seems to be saying that someone can be separate just to be destroyed and had no solution, like a person who is not consecrated, but quite the opposite. We can see that by his actions, he has been separated. He separates himself and puts himself as, instead of being holy, the opposite, as a curse, something bad, something destructive, and something that deserves death. On the other hand, taking into account the context of when this was discussed in this chapter, it was talking about consecrating things that could be referring to the type of person, since in Hebrew the word translated as curse is haram, which means to ban, to devote, to destroy utterly, completely destroy, dedicate for destruction, exterminate, especially dedicated to religious use. So here we see that it does not refer to something bad and could be understood as a surrender with where death is necessary. So we see here that religiously, a person could, how can I explain this? A person was putting themselves, not that the Eternal was saying, well, I see that Peter is misbehaving, so I'm going to put a sign on him and he is meant to be destroyed. Absolutely not. Here we see that it had to be from the person's decisions, life decisions, that they put that mark on themselves to be destroyed because of their action, because of the way that they lived and their rebellion. So we see this very interesting thing, this very interesting point in these commandments, meaning that a person who chooses to live in rebellion, like for example, if a son chooses to live in rebellion, knowing what is good and what is bad from the instruction, the mother could not go to the Kohen and say, I want to redeem my my son, and that nothing should happen, and that the father can forgive him for everything, right? It's not like the indulgencies that we see in the Catholic Church, that they say, well, pay this certain amount of money and your relative will leave hell. It's not that. So we see here that no matter, it's everybody has an individual choice, whether they decide to be good and they decide to obey the Eternal, or they simply decide to rebel and disobey the Eternal and become his enemy, and nobody can do anything about it. And what happens is that that person who's in direct rebellion to the Eternal then falls into judgment. And it's really sad, because the Eternal truly gives us all the time for us to come back to him into repentance. He doesn't want any soul to be perished, but he can't also force people to obey him, because then it would be a dictatorship. For us, all of these things we see, or for us, through Mashiach Yeshua, we are called to follow his example, presenting ourselves as living sacrifice, pleasing before the Creator, not perhaps in the literal way that was done within the context through the animals, taking into account that Mashiach was the last perfect korban or sacrifice for which we can present ourselves as a holocaust, right? As a complete surrender to his service, to serve the Eternal in spirit and in truth. As in Romans 8:13 says the following: For if you live according to the flesh, you must die. But if by the Ruach you put to death the deeds of the body, you shall live. So we see here in everything, in consecrating the things that the Eternal, things to the Eternal, things that we want to give to the Eternal, we have to understand that if we're doing it according to the flesh, according to some kind of benefit, then it's not going to become a true vow, and we're going to die in the sense of not being in the Eternal's favor. And we see here, but if we live by the Ruach, meaning having the Eternal's presence in our life, then it's automatic thing that we die to the deeds of the body in order for us to live. And in the last verse, it says the following: These are the mitzvot, or the commandments, which Adonai commanded Moshe for Ben Yisrael on the Mount Sinai. So lastly, we see that the Eternal states that these commandments of consecration, these commandments of knowing what is pure, what is impure, were given through Moshe for the people of Israel to follow. Remembering, right, that the Eternal chose Israel for the purpose to be light to this world and be an example of what consecration and sanctification should look like. Not because the Eternal has some favor, or that the Israelites or the Jewish people is preferred by the Eternal, but it's mostly for them. In that time, they were supposed to show the world who didn't know the Torah, who didn't have the instruction of the word of the Eternal, to show it in example, to show it in their lives, in order for others to be converted. And now, in conclusion, coming to the conclusion of all of this chapter and all of the book, we remember that we began this book with a calling, because Vayikra in Hebrew means "and he called." After a series of instructions and commandments that the people of Israel needed to follow in different aspects of their life for the purpose of being in the presence of the Almighty, to be people who understood the level of holiness they needed in order to approach the Eternal, was something that we saw throughout this entire book, and taught us as well that we can't just come to the Eternal as any way that we please. There is a certain way, there is one path, which is through Yeshua. These instructions led the people of Israel to live a life of holiness with the divine presence among them for a while, knowing what the Eternal considers as purity and impurity, for them to understand and distinguish between the holy and unholy, and then act accordingly. Just the way that we are supposed to know now, right? What is acceptable to the Eternal and what is unacceptable to the Eternal, in order for us to comply in action and be able to return back to the Eternal the way that He wants. This book taught us the same principles that was given to Israel. Maybe not in the literal sense, because we don't have a temple, we don't have ministers anymore, we don't have cattle, we don't in this society we don't live off the agriculture as it used to be, something vital, but nevertheless, these commandments, we are still following them because we learn the same spirit that it was given. And in order for us to fulfill a purpose that the commandments had, in order for us to fulfill the celestial purpose in us. So now in the souls that Mashiach raised, the souls, the people, the believers, all these instructions continue to be a very necessary aspect in our life, in the believer's life, to seek to be set apart for the Creator, being committed in two ways. First, with the obedience to the Creator through Yeshua, our Mashiach, to obtain better promises. And finally, what is shown in this chapter is that commitment, not only by words, but that they should be supported by actions of obedience. And with this, may the Eternal help us reach the level of consecration and holiness that He seeks in all of us. We are called to holiness, as our Elohim is holy, set apart of this world, to enter into the kingdom that Yeshua approximated. With this, let us remember what Peter, the apostle or the Shaliach, said in 1 Peter chapter 2 from verse 9 to 10 to conclude. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of Elohim's own possession, so that you may proclaim the praises of the one who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are Elohim's people. You were shown no mercy, but now you have been shown mercy. And with this, may the Eternal help all of us to truly continue to consecrate our lives, to truly become close to Him through Yeshua, and that we may learn how all of these commandments given to the people of Israel for the purpose to get close to the Eternal, have an intimate relationship with Him, can show us how we also are supposed to approach the Eternal in consecration, in obedience, in sanctification, consecration, dedication, and all of these things that the Eternal is looking for all of us. And well, if the Eternal gives us more life, I shall see you in another video. Shalom.